Hello, everybody, and a very warm welcome. Good evening, I suppose I should really be saying, to this webinar. First of all, can I just say a huge thank you to those of you who've joined us live this evening, and to those of you who I know may be watching this as a recording. We really do appreciate that time is so precious, always. But even more so at the moment, isn't it? So thank you ever so much for spending a bit of time with us today. And before I forget, a huge thank you to the people who've made this possible. This couldn't happen without people behind the scenes, as you can well imagine. So a big thank you to Becky and to Katie, who are helping out this evening. And they will be there on hand to answer any of your technical questions. So if you do have a problem with technology, please do type it into the questions box and one of them will get back to you straight away. I should just say we've got over, well, at the moment, nearly 240 people taking part in this session. So obviously that makes it a bit tricky to answer any questions kind of live as we go along. But if you've got anything you want to ask, please do drop me a line. I'll make sure you get my email address. So please do feel free to get in touch with us. We're always really delighted to hear from you. But yeah, really, really great that you can join us. I hope you're all safe, you're all well, and sitting somewhere comfortably, hopefully with a cup of tea or coffee, or maybe even a glass of wine at this time of day, and ready for this short session looking at remote learning. As I said, really, really great that you're able to be with us. My name is Phil Armstrong. Those of you who don't know me, my role is supporting schools and settings across the south of England predominantly, and also our international schools that we work with. But increasingly, in this kind of remote world that we work in, more and more of my work has been working across the country, which has been really exciting, and lots of opportunities to have conversations with schools and settings in places that I would never normally get to find out how things have been going and to hear their stories. So it's been a really interesting time for me, even though it's an incredibly challenging time for all of us. And again, for those of you who don't know Early Excellence, just a quick overview. We provide lots of CPD and support for schools and settings, both in terms of training, online training like this, consultancy, and we've been doing that for over 20 years. We also help schools and settings in developing their classroom environments, so furniture and resources and so on. And then we have about 500 schools that use our assessment tracker called EXAT, which is from birth to 5 years of age. The best place to find out lots and lots of information about us is to have a look on our website. Lots and lots of things there for you to find out, some fantastic images, some really good video clips of schools that we've worked with, some nice case studies. And at the end, I'll also highlight some blogs that we have at the moment, which may be of particular interest with regard to remote learning, but there are lots of other things there and lots of free resources as well. So please do take a look. This session is really short. And when I was starting to think of putting things together for it, I thought, my word, this is an enormous subject, and one that we're really all starting to get to grips with. It's certainly not something that was ever covered in any teacher training that I participated in. And if we step back a year ago, probably something that would never have ever crossed our mind that it was something we need to think about, and particularly with regard to working with younger children. So what I thought would be helpful in this short session is really just to think about what it might be your priorities in terms of your children. I thought particularly thinking about language and communication and the kind of challenges that remote learning could present with that, but also perhaps some opportunities as well. And then a few kind of practical ideas that tie into what we know about how young children learn. But what I want to kind of say at the start is, I think it can feel really overwhelming, can't it, with everything else that's going on at the moment, to try and feel like you've got it right in terms of remote learning. I think we are all learning how to do it. And I think we need to be mindful of that, and particularly balancing. I know many of you will be providing some remote learning, perhaps some learning for children who are actually with you as well, those children who are parents of key workers and so on. Finding that balance, finding that time, really, really hard. And sometimes we can get the impression that everybody is doing it amazingly. And I think what I've learned through conversations that I've had over the last few weeks is that everybody is still finding their way with it. And what we'd hope to do at Early Excellence really is to provide an opportunity and a platform for you really to share those ideas. So please do kind of, if you use social media, post stuff on Facebook and Twitter and copy us in so that we can kind of share it with as wide an audience as possible, because everybody's trying to learn from each other at the moment. And I think that is so important, because what I don't know about yourselves, but what I'm really missing at the moment is opportunities to sit and have a chat with a colleague, to talk with someone who's doing the same thing as me, so that I can then take those ideas and use them in my own practice. So if we can use social media, if we can use other ways, Zoom or whatever it may be, to help each other learn what's gone well with remote learning and what's not going quite so well, I think that will be really, really appreciated by many, many people in the sector at the moment. And I make no apology for starting with this slide because I use it so often. But I just want to keep reminding myself, I suppose, as much as anybody else, is what an amazing time early childhood is. And I love this way that Jenny Linden describes it as this explosion of experiences, because those experiences are still happening. They're just different experiences for our children. But it still is, for so many of them, it's the first time, isn't it? When you think of the weather, I mean, here we actually had some great snow on Sunday, and you could just see the joy in some children's faces, and some amazing things that they built as a result of it. A sort of very, very creative snow dog that somebody actually made. But this idea that children can still have a wonderful childhood. But it's just going to be a different one at the moment, isn't it? And I think we need that to sustain us, don't we? To know that childhood still is amazing, and that's kind of our kind of role, isn't it? Really. I know that Jude, Jude Twani, some of you might know, is watching along today. So a big hello to Jude. And Jude and I were really lucky. We were at a conference in Guernsey a couple of years ago, and the theme was the joy of childhood. And I think if nothing can get us through this, I think it is that joyfulness of childhood, and how they are managing this experience in some ways often better than we are. And they give us that energy, don't they? They give us that renewed energy to cope with it as well. And I also wanted to remind us of that idea that when we're thinking about early childhood education, now, whether it be remote or whether it be face to face or whatever format it takes, is we need to be thinking about that whole child and looking after all of those roots. Because perhaps the risk is if we don't keep an eye on all of them, when they do return to school, to settings, perhaps they're going to need an awful lot of care with one particular aspect. So thinking about what's that child needing to help them to grow, to help them to thrive in the best possible way, reminding us of that is so important. So just some kind of pause for thought, I suppose, really. And whenever I've been speaking to someone about how they're managing remote learning, the first questions that seem to come up are, what's the thing that's worrying you? And in result of that is, what are your priorities? And for many, the first concern is sometimes safety for those children. How are those more vulnerable children? And I know schools and settings have been doing amazing work to make sure that they are really closely connected to those families, to those children who they are the most worried about. And I think that's the thing that keeps us awake at night, isn't it? It's who are we really worried about, and how can we use our energy and our time to really make sure that we know that those children are okay. And you hear constantly incredible stories of what people working in education are doing, going above and beyond to really make sure the wider needs of those children are met. But also alongside that, what are perhaps your other priorities? What aspects are you worried about in terms of learning? And we know, don't we, there's going to be this ongoing discussion, as there was when we returned after the first lockdown, about what's the gap going to be like, what children may not know, but also what children might know as well is so important for us to consider, isn't it? So taking that time to pause and to think, and perhaps if you can, to have those conversations with colleagues in school about who are we really worried about, and what can we do to help make sure we're supporting them most effective way. And reminding ourselves of what to me is perhaps the most, I suppose, the bedrock, the cornerstone of early years practice, and that idea that children are unique. And of course, the implication therefore is their remote experience is going to be unique as well. We can step in their homes through that camera, and we can see things that are happening face to face through there. But we can only be visitors in that home. We're not living in that home. So we have to kind of gain as much information as we can about what's it like to be that child in that particular experience, and drawing on everything we know about them from the times that we have been working with them to help make sure that that remote experience that we are offering is the most appropriate for that child. Back thinking in the summer, I remember doing some work with Nursery World, and one of the things we were talking about is how actually some children have had a really amazing experience during lockdown, and when they've been away from school and so on, how they've learned to do things they never would have done before, how they've built relationships with their parents that they might never have built in the same way before. But I wonder perhaps if we're all feeling this time round it's more challenging than ever, despite the hope of the vaccine and so on. Are we perhaps feeling like this is a tough time? And how is that being reflected in the experience of children having? I think it's something we always need to keep be mindful of and to explore. Way back in April, it seems such a long time ago, it was when the weather was sunny, for those of you who can remember those days. There was a report that actually the Education Endowment Foundation published into remote learning. Now, it was based on evidence that was pre-COVID, but it was the only thing that was out at that particular time. And what, for me, really came across quite strongly was the fact that there was, first of all, there was very little evidence. It was based on when schools had had forced closures for extended periods of times and so on. And what evidence was available was very limited in terms of early years. It just hadn't really been looked at before. So we are in a new era, I suppose, of gathering information to see what impact remote learning has, particularly when it comes to young children. But some of the things that they already picked up at that stage, I thought were quite interesting kind of pointers as to where we might have been heading. And reassuringly, the idea that quality was key, really, rather than the methodology of delivery. It was back to really good quality teaching, using what you know about the children, what they've learned before, and so on. That seemed to be making the best difference when it came to remote learning, working with those different age groups. Also, that kind of access to technology, they'd already picked up that was a significant concern. And I think that's something that we've become all incredibly aware of over the last year, is just how different that access is for our families. And again, schools have been and settings have been really, really creative in the way that they've tried to get around this. And I think we know it's a national issue, but also that kind of comfortableness, I guess, with technology. I think we need to, that's something we're going to ongoing have to work with, particularly in our partnership working with parents, isn't it? It's just how comfortable they are in using IT, if we're going to be using it as part of more and more of our practice in terms of remote learning. They also found that actually peer interaction was really powerful, and that opportunity for children to actually talk to other children. And I think that's something that probably many of the children we work with are really, really missing. It's that peer interaction, missing friends, but also we know how valuable those conversations are between young children in terms of supporting their learning. And interestingly, they found that different approaches work better for different age groups. And I think we've all found that as we've gone along, haven't we? And what I'm not going to discuss in this particular session, because again, it's quite short, but I know there are so many different platforms that people are using, different online tools that people are using to make things accessible to their children and to help support them with different aspects of the curriculum. But again, I think it's important, whichever one we are using, that we keep checking that is this the right one for the age of the children we're working with? Is this really helping them with their learning? Rather than perhaps sometimes where we have a generic system that everybody in school uses, for example. Does it really do the job you want it to do? And I think that's an important question that we need to ask. So since all of that, we have actually had some more information come out. And this report came out in January from Ofsted. Now, I know at the moment Ofsted isn't always the favourite word that everyone wants to hear, but what I wanted to do is look at what they have found since over the last year and how it may relate to early years practice, and to really kind of provoke some thinking around it. So I hope this is helpful. I'm not sure if you've seen the report. It's available on the Ofsted website. It's really short, but I think worth having a little look at. And the first point that Daniel, who wrote the report, makes out is that we need to see remote education as not the same as digital education. And I think that's a really powerful statement, because there is the risk, isn't it, that everything becomes a bit like an IT activity without a teacher being engaged. And I kind of reflect back a little bit to when I was first teaching, and there were lots of IT programs to support aspects of maths and various bits of the curriculum. But actually, they were more about IT than they were about learning. They were about children manipulating keyboards and so on. But they weren't really engaged in the process. So I think we need to kind of separate the kind of digital bit out of it. The digital tool is something that can help us with remote education, but we're not teaching them a digital curriculum, I guess, as such. So yes, that idea of this very young child sat there learning how to use a laptop. I can imagine many of you been in this situation fairly recently and discovered that your own work laptop is probably not in the best condition it can be. And we know that many homes may, if they have got access to a laptop, there may only be one there that's being shared across lots and lots of siblings and so on. And it's thinking that, is this the best way for the learning to take place? Are there other things that we can do for that remote learning model? The next thing that they pointed out was the idea of keeping things as simple as possible and reminding us that the young children we're working with are still young children. And so we need to keep going back to what is it we know about young children and what really helps them with their learning, rather than suddenly thinking that these children are completely different, that they've transformed into a digital kind of version of them. They are still young 3, 4, 5, 6-year-olds. They're still, their brains are still developing in a way that they would have been before. They're obviously having some different experiences, but also their physical development as well. And I wish in some ways Ofsted had put that in, because we know that that's become a particular issue for some children. So we need to remind ourselves of this, don't we? And just how complex early childhood is, and all of that masses of learning that takes place in those first few years, and what makes that happen, and what are the things that we need to try and find a way to foster through the remote learning experience, so that they still flourish and thrive as a young child. And it's challenging, isn't it? It's really, really complex. But we need to keep mindful of that whenever we're thinking about what is our remote offer going to be for young children. And so we know these things, don't we? And many of you who've done some training with in the past will be familiar with these. But I think it's important that we remind ourselves of them. The idea that for young children, they do need those real first-hand experiences. It's so important. And that presents particular challenges for us in terms of remote learning, because of accessibility to resources and so on. So when we're suggesting remote learning activities, perhaps we need to be thinking about, well, what might they have at home that we can use to help support that learning? We know that it's really important for children to go back to the same kind of idea, to revisit ideas in lots and lots of different contexts. We know that, don't we, with the way we set up our environments with continuous revision and so on, how important it is to go back. So when we're thinking about the remote learning offer, we need to be thinking about, rather than lots and lots of new things, what is it we're trying to really deepen their understanding of, and how can we do that in lots and lots of different ways? Of course, we're trying to help them become amazing learners, and to build on that kind of amazing learning power that young children have. And those behaviours, and when we think about the characteristics of learning, self-regulation, and so on, we still need to try and find ways to help support those as much as possible. And of course, one of our key tools working as an early years practitioner is that ability to tap into what we know young children are fascinated by, what actually motivates them already. And of course, that we know our individual groups of children, what they really, really are passionate about. And it's using those things, isn't it, in a way to, normally within our classroom, to create amazing environments for children that feature those things. But we need to also think about how can we support them within the home in the same way. So if we think about predictable interests, we know there are certain things that young children are fascinated in, whether they be a young child in Birmingham or a young child in Bangkok. These seem to be the things that children are really, really motivated by and interested in learning more about. And if we look at them, many of them are connected to things that happen in their everyday life, things that happen in the home, routines and things associated with the home. Things that happen perhaps just outside the window, and if they're lucky to have a garden, things that are happening outside. And then they gradually become more and more interested, of course, in the wider world and that kind of fascination with transport that sometimes children develop, or with dinosaurs, whatever it may be. And then, of course, we know they get really interested in fantasy and make believe, those story characters, those cartoon characters, the film characters that they want to become themselves as they're exploring who they are in the world as well. So we need to be thinking about whatever our curriculum offer is, be it within school and setting or remotely, are we still tapping into all of these things? And if the children are at home, which ones perhaps are going to be easy for us to really make the most of at this particular time? The next thing that they talk about is when you are adapting that curriculum, is really thinking about what is it you really want your children to know, to understand, to develop that deeper learning about, rather perhaps than spreading a bit too thin. So really thinking about, goes back to that, what might be your priorities? What do you feel is going to give the most benefit to your children so that they can continue really successfully on their own learning journey? And that's going to be unique, isn't it, for each of your children? It's like, what is it they really, really need? However, there may be some commonalities across a particular group. So I mentioned earlier on about the characteristics of effective teaching and learning. And I think when I spoke to some schools and settings after the first lockdown and when children started returning, one of the things they mentioned a lot was how those children who were really secure in the characteristics seemed to have done really, really well in terms of their transition and returning and so on, but also during that lockdown period. And often lots of the activities and information that have been shared with those schools and settings about what the children have done were very much linked to the characteristics. And to me, they're such a powerful tool, aren't they? Because we know that the curriculum itself will evolve and change, but we know that what makes a really good learner makes a really good learner. And one of the things that we're going to be talking about in the session that we're going to be doing for parents is particularly helping them with unpicking the characteristics of effective learning and really thinking about how they can support those at home so that the children are just thriving as learners. Thought it might be useful just to explore a little bit about interaction and language development. And this has come through from some of the conversations we had with schools that are doing remote learning at the moment as being one of their real concerns. It's who is supporting and how are they supporting the children with this? Because it was their concern before lockdown, before remote learning. The concern has not gone away. And in fact, if anything, it has deepened. And how important interactions are for us. And we know that ourselves, don't we? From having a conversation with someone you've not spoken to for months to having that Zoom call, we know those moments are so important. They're that opportunity for us to touch base, to sense how somebody is, but also to broaden our own minds, to talk about things that are different, to have exciting conversations, to kind of, for some of us, to step outside our front door virtually and have a new conversation. But when we're thinking about young children, we also know that particularly that sort of first 5 years of life, and even younger still, how important those interactions are in terms of promoting early language development. So I think it's poignant that people are really focusing in on this. Some of you, I'm sure, may have seen this image before, and whenever I've shown it on training before, there's usually a bit of gasp of horror of how did someone let this happen? But this was before we were in the current kind of remote environment and the lockdowns environment. But the idea that the screen can replace that human interaction. And I think it's a real challenge for us doing remote learning, because at the moment it has, to a certain extent for some children, become the thing that they are interacting with possibly the most. So that whenever we have the opportunity to have a live interaction with the children, we really need to make the most of it, don't we? And to really help them, I suppose, to really show that we value that time with them. So important. Technology, there's no doubt about it, is amazing. Where would we be at the moment without it? I couldn't be talking to you, for example, but I think we need to be really careful. And it's back to that idea of digital learning versus remote learning, and how the two things, we need to be careful of the two things getting confused. There's some more rather scary images there of, I'm sure some people who thought they were very wise inventing such things, but how important it is, we need to be really, really careful about that. And particularly in terms of conversations with parents, and really reminding parents that the best thing they can do is talk with their children, isn't it? And have those everyday conversations. And so that kind of reminder really about how hard it is to actually have a conversation. And I just wanted to share this. I know we've been using this as part of some training we do around communication language development, and it's based on work from kind of the ICANN resources and so on. But just that kind of reminder of how complex the whole process of having a conversation is. And how we need to help ensure we can support children with each step along that way. But also really thinking at the moment about how hard that is to do when we're working remotely. If they were struggling before with some aspects of this, which bits are we going to need to give most attention to? Because we're not having a normal conversation when we have it through the screen. Things are slightly different. Sometimes it's slightly more difficult to interpret what somebody's saying, how they're behaving, their facial expressions, and so on. And that's if it's all working perfectly. So thinking about, if we are doing some live learning with the children, are they really understanding what we're saying? Are they able to interpret those words? And are they therefore able to answer us? Are they able to give a response because they've been able to understand what someone was having a conversation to them about? I think it's really important that I suppose we step into their shoes, into their digital remote shoes, and imagine what it might be like for them, particularly if they were struggling before. Did they need some support before? And then if you are using some kind of online grouping, so perhaps you're only talking to small groups of children at a time, thinking about how we modify our interactions in terms of working with those children to make sure they can really participate in the conversation as fully as possible. Yeah, a real challenge. And I think we're all going to end up slightly better at it. When I think about how we've all got so much better at things like Zoom, although it's funny, before we start today's session, we were all kind of talking about how we occasionally don't know which button to press and so on. And all of those things can get in the way, can't they, of the conversation? It's the stuff that stops the learning from happening, I guess, sometimes. So when we're having those conversations, or when we're doing some live learning with the children, I think these things we need to be mindful of all the time, that kind of time to listen and allowing them time to process things that we've been saying. Dead air through the internet can feel like a very long time, but I think it's so important, isn't it, that we wait for children to respond and give them that time to think, to process, that time to answer. And also, if we are using new vocabulary, have we given them a chance for them to really interpret that, to embed it, so that they've got a chance to use it in those conversations, but also they understand when someone else is using it as well. So we need to be really careful of how we manage that time when we are having those live conversations. Do we need to do some learning beforehand, perhaps, that's going to help that conversation take place, and the children will be able to engage more actively as part of the process? These are again, I, these are something we talk about sometimes when we're thinking about interactions, but I think they're really important when it comes to thinking about promoting talk through remote learning. And first of all, that idea of somewhere to talk. And we know that for many children, the remote learning environment does not always create the perfect space for them to sit and have that online interaction with you. There may be lots and lots of other people in the house. There may be lots of things going on, and it's that presents real challenges, doesn't it? But I think because we've all kind of been in that situation ourselves, we're learning how to manage it as effectively as possible. But it's back to that understanding what is that child's unique experience. I think is really, really key. Something exciting to talk about. Well, we think when children are in school, there are in settings, there are so many exciting things to talk about all the time. I always love this picture because these boys have just had an amazing time building these structures, haven't they, with the blocks of the small world. And you can imagine the conversations that would take place as a result of that. Similarly, children working outdoors, they've had a chance to access some resources. They're working alongside each other. The conversation's just bubbling and flowing, isn't it? And similarly here is this role play cafe. You just know they're all going to be chatting. Oh, for the days when we could go and sit in a cafe again. But they naturally promote opportunities for talk. And of course, we're presented with different situations at the moment, aren't we? So, what is it that your children are likely to be experiencing? What are the things that they are going to be doing at home? What's their day to day life going to be like that they're going to be able to talk about as part of short conversations with you live? Are they actually seeing any other children as part of a support bubble, for example? Are they connected with other family members through Zoom or through Skype calls or whatever it is? Are they perhaps in sometimes connecting with people they never normally would? So have they got some stories about those people to share? Do they help with the shopping? Have they been outside playing? Have they got some younger siblings who perhaps are still going to settings and so on? What have they got to talk about in their everyday lives? And I think it could be that for some of the children, this has very much become everyday life. And I think we're all kind of aware that this can happen to all of us very, very easy, isn't it? And particularly at this time of year when it's cold and it's grey, and let's kind of, let's watch some Netflix and so on. And for some of our children, we know that this may be what's happening a lot at the moment. So perhaps what they might need are some prompts to help them feel like their experiences are just as special as their peers. It reminds me a little bit of when children used to write their news. And there was those children who would write, amazing, exciting things that they'd done at the weekend. And then with some children who it was pretty much the same thing each weekend. And sometimes when you had a conversation with them, they'd start to feel that what they did was perhaps less special, less exciting. And I think what we need to do is help them see the specialness in what they do and to tease that out, don't we? And kind of really explore what it is that they've been doing, but also recognize how they might be feeling about that as well. Just going to kind of share a few other ideas now. I hope these will be helpful about other different sort of aspects of curriculum and some practical sort of ideas as well. But I wanted to start with this image just as a reminder, really, that it could be something as simple as a flower. It could be something as simple as a piece of fruit. It could be something really small. And I think seeing the beauty in something small is something we all occasionally need to do and be reminded of. And often I find working with young children, having the chance to see something fresh through their eyes is not only a tremendous privilege, but also kind of reawakens something within yourself. And seen some amazing things where literally children will just explore one thing in a great deal of detail and really get immersed in it, really unpick what is this thing, and also that bit of awe and wonder as well, which we need to kind of hang on to as much as possible, don't we? Never forgetting that joy. So one of the things that I thought of was what do children instinctively love to do? And I sort of thinking about how they love to build, how they love to construct, how they love to make. And I know within our schools and settings, we can offer amazing ranges of resources for them to use. And that might be slightly more limited when it comes to the home. But that creative drive is still in there, that kind of instinct that they have to put things together, to turn them into something else, whether it be a ready-made small construction kit or whether it be junk model making and so on. They have that ability to see the potential in those resources. And I love this poem from A.A. Milne. I'll just pause and let you have a read of that for a moment. I really love that idea that you can make anything, can't you? And one of the things I often find quite interesting when we do courses about outdoor learning, and you ask people to reminisce about what they did as a child themselves when they're playing outside, one of the things that often comes up is how they made their own resources. They were able to kind of, I think, through their imagination and creativity, to build the things they wanted to build rather than having something ready made. And I wonder if this is the opportunity for children to rediscover that, to have those opportunities to just have a go, really. And it ties back into that idea with the characteristics, doesn't it? That kind of having a go, not worrying if it's going to go wrong. It doesn't really matter. It's them taking that turn, taking that leap to have a go at making something. And of course, a wonderful opportunity to work alongside their siblings, adults, and so on, to have a go at building together. And of course, the simplest tool of all and resource of all is the cardboard box. I know many of us in the team, we often laugh when schools have spent a lot of money investing in some of our resources, and what the schools and settings will share back with us is, do you know what, they also really love the cardboard boxes and how they've used them to turn them into all kinds of things. And it made me think about probably what is the most interaction many of us are having at the moment is with someone from, it's Amazon delivery or the equivalent. You know, boxes have never been so abundant in some cases. So that idea of you can take something, you can be whatever you want to be. And there's been some really lovely images I've seen around social media of children building amazing structures, castles, houses, famous landmarks, all kinds of things, using resources they find around the house. So it could be cardboard boxes, it could be things that were going to go into the recycling, but it could also be if they've got Lego, it could be if they've got Mobile, it could be if they've got Duplo, it could be whatever they've got. But the idea is that they are being the builder and using all of those kind of creative skills that we know that they have. Of course, for many of us, I imagine what we'd really like to do sometimes is literally do what this little girl is doing and curl up inside that cardboard box. I think we can all relate to her and how sometimes that's just what we need to do. And I think that's something we also need to be mindful when it comes to remote learning. For some children, for some families, there just might be too much going on for us to actually have an expectation they're going to participate in all the activities we're offering and so on. And I think many of us can relate to that at the moment. Sometimes we need our space, don't we? And then to find a way that we can sensitively reconnect with people. I just thought I'd drop this in as well. If you're thinking about sort of design projects and construction projects with the children, using these kind of prompts, the ask, what is it you're going to try and build? What's the problem? Perhaps, designing a bridge, building a bridge to go across something, and how you're going to make it so that your toy can go across the bridge and so on. So giving them that little bit of a challenge can be really, really helpful. But again, being mindful that whatever expectation you're setting, thinking about have they got the things there that's going to be able to make that happen? Have they got the time? Have they got the resources? And then when an activity has taken place, everybody being valued and celebrated as well. So I thought that might be just helpful as kind of a bit of a prompt there. I also wanted to talk about story making. And when I think about story making, I particularly think about Small World. where often when I'm helping someone set up their small world area, I talk about it as being a bit like a story factory, because that's what children are doing, aren't they? They're creating imaginative stories, using the resources that are there, building worlds, creating characters, building a narrative. And often when we step back and we listen to what's happening there, it is incredibly complex, isn't it? And we know that link between oral language and early literacy is so critical, isn't it? And the opportunity to develop stories around characters is really, really important in terms of supporting children with their early literacy. So what does Small World kind of offer? Well, of course, it's incredibly empowering for young children because they are the kind of the masters of that world. They can, of course, draw on some of their previous experiences, their prior learning, whether it be from stories, from films, or if it's building structures, their knowledge of design and so forth. But it's very, very empowering. And again, it can often be quite sustained long-term play. And if we are thinking about Small World as a strategy around remote learning, we need to be thinking again about what they might have at home. So, do they have small world figures perhaps linked to a story? Do they have more traditional ones, sort of farm characters, people who help us type characters? Do they have superhero type figures? It's exploring with them, isn't it? What do they have? So then they can use it in a way to create a story, to create the world that they want to share those stories with you, whether it be through photographs, whether it be through talk, whether it be through creating stories, lots and lots of possibilities. But what it's encouraging children to do all the time is to keep stretching that imagination, to keep working on it like a muscle, and also encouraging them to talk about that world that they've created. So discovering what they have at home will obviously be really, really key to supporting with that. Just some ideas again about artistic opportunities. It's been interesting looking on social media because there's been some amazing examples. I'd encourage you to keep an eye out of how schools and settings have been able to do some kind of collaborative art activities with their children, and that kind of creating pictures. And what we'd recommend is thinking about really open-ended opportunities for the children, and particularly thinking around things like transient art. Because again, we need to be thinking about, well, what might children actually have at home if we're going to be suggesting these as remote learning experiences for them. So we know, don't we, within our own schools and settings, we see this thing happening, don't we? Children creating amazing patterns and designs and sequencing and so on, using a whole range of resources in terms of loose part play, transient art, and so on. They have the resources there, they have those opportunities. And we know that can lead on to creating art outside, for example. And these are just a few pictures there, just to kind of remind us of what they can do and just how beautiful they can be. Of course, kind of drawing on the work of Andy Goldsworthy and similar artists. And if we are then thinking about, oh, we're going to talk to our parents about this as a possibility, then what kind of things might they have at home? What natural materials and leaves and so on, and sticks and twigs and what have you, but also other materials, recyclable materials, milk bottle tops, cardboard tubes, lids. The list is kind of endless, isn't it? And of course, the joy of so many of these resources is they're not going to cost anything. They are there at home for children to use. If they're trying to think about what they might want to use as a background, some things that work particularly well are perhaps a piece of fabric. We know sometimes we've used old picture frames to create that kind of workspace for children to work in. But thinking about a kind of plain or contrasting background can really help the work pop out. And they may need us to give some examples, first of all, to kind of model it, to kind of talk through some ideas, just to get the ball rolling. But what I've found whenever I've done kind of a transient art activity with children, very quickly, within a few moments, you see them kind of appearing all over the setting. Both inside and outside. It's like they've had like a door unlocked. They suddenly realize the potential of what they can do. Actually, though, when I think about it, one of the people I now realize has always done transient art, was certainly doing it as a child, was actually my sister. Every time she ate a satsuma or something like that, she would peel it meticulously, take every bit of pith that ever existed of it, and then arrange it in a particular pattern on her plate. And she did that all of the time. It was just within her. The same if she had a tube of Smartie. Things had to be arranged. It was obviously something deeply innate with her. She's now a school business manager, so I don't know if there's a connection between the two things. Here are just some ideas, some lovely images here of things that children have created. I love that idea of using it in a baking tray. And then, of course, imagine if you put a bit of water in there and see what happens, and the image starts to change, things floating around, lots of possibilities there. And then if we want to give them some other examples, things to do, we could say, well, do you want to make a picture of something that you know, of a person you know, of your pet, of your house, and so on? But again, it's keeping that open-ended as possible, isn't it? Exploring how things go together, which things look well together, which shapes go together, and so on. This was something I just saw yesterday, actually, on Twitter. I just thought I wanted to share with you. They'd obviously given the children the kind of challenge, make some people, make a person. And you can see how creative these children have been at home using different resources. Really, really exciting. Just really made me smile when I saw those pictures. But there are lots of many more examples. And if we're thinking about offering these experiences as part of our remote learning package, I think it's also important that we think about how they can connect in with our curriculum, so that we are reassuring colleagues, but also reassuring parents that actually this is really going to support. It's not just a lovely thing to do, it's really going to support many aspects of young children's learning. So, for example, we know it helps support vocabulary, enriching that vocabulary, talking about the properties of the materials and the objects they're using, their designs and so on, and really can spark a conversation. We know that when they're creating those worlds using those kind of loose parts materials, again, that's really going to support with their literacy. There is huge potential for this type of activity in terms of mathematics, and particularly shape, space and measure, pattern, positioning, and so on. Those really core math skills. And of course, great opportunity for science as well, looking at those different materials. What do they feel like? What are they made of? Are they man-made? And so on. Lots and lots of doors being opened to us in terms of curriculum potential. And I think that can be really helpful in terms of planning what sort of remote learning we want to offer and why we want to offer it. And actually been interesting, as part of some other work been looking at around loose parts play. There is research out there, it's still in its infancy but starting to grow, about the real potential for loose parts play in terms of supporting children's learning in lots and lots of different ways. So if you're interested, I'd encourage you to look more into it as well. But lots of kind of problem solving, communication, decision making, all kinds of things there. Interestingly, it talks about helping learning behaviours like sharing and so on. And I wonder when, if we think about it remotely, is there going to be opportunities for perhaps siblings to work together on something as well? Lots and lots of possibilities there. So next bit, thinking about some words to use for the children, we go back to that idea of what a good talker needs. I think what we must never underestimate is the incredible vocabulary of the home, and how rich it is, and how it's the vocabulary that children are kind of immersed in first, and how if we can connect that as part of our remote learning strategy, we are really going to support them as part of that ongoing language development, thinking about what are the conversations going to be at home, what are going to be the words. That's really key. And alongside that, thinking about that progression in language. Do they start to understand how some things connect together with something else as well? And particularly thinking about relation to the everyday language they use at the home. And this is just a reminder of how perhaps we need to be thinking about that language progression. And the idea of the things that children are familiar with every day, and both within our schools and settings, but particularly thinking about remote learning, what's the language of the home? What are things that they're going to come across every day that when we're having an online conversation with the children, they're all going to have that shared understanding? And then those higher frequency words, ones that particularly relate to specific activities perhaps as well. And how do we support children with gradually enriching their vocabulary bank without overwhelming it? And are they using that vocabulary in meaningful ways as well? And I think that's something that we need to be mindful of whenever we're planning remote activities. What are the words that we're hoping the children are going to gain from this? And how are we going to monitor whether we can hear them being used? So here's just some examples here. So for example, in terms of water, isn't it? So we think of everyday water words like wet and dry and cold and so on. Then we move on to those kind of capacity words like full and empty, or melting like the ice and snow over the last few days. And then some really specific words like evaporate and liquid, droplet and so on. How are we helping children develop that through remote learning? I think presents some challenges for us, but also opportunities in terms of the way that we engage with them in small groups. The next bit that in Ofsted that they pulled up in their report was, again, similar in what they found in the Education Endowment Foundation research, that peer interactions can be really motivational. And I think that, again, has implications for how we are managing perhaps live learning. Are we giving children opportunities to talk to each other? And what size of group we feel works best for that as well. Because I think we've all kind of had those situations, haven't we? We've done like big circle times where only 2 or 3 children actually contribute, and we know there's one child who's dreading their turn, and so on. So thinking about how can we make sure that children get a chance to talk to each other, to celebrate what the other children have been doing. It reminded me of those children you work with who can't wait to show you what another child has done in a positive way. They really want to see the picture that somebody has painted. And I think above all, it's because they really want to keep a relationship with their friends. And how can we help foster that? It is really key, isn't it, to so much that we're doing. Interestingly, they found that, again, similar to the Education Endowment Foundation, it's the quality that is key, not necessarily how it's being delivered in terms of the technology. But I've put a bit there because what they have found is trying to do remote learning using technology like laptops and tablets and phones and so, they found almost the smaller the device, the lower the impact has been. So we know, don't we, for some families, that kind of the only access may be a tablet or maybe a phone. And I think we need to be mindful that some things don't seem to be working quite as well. I think it's going to be interesting to see more research. I'm sure will come out later on in the year to see a bit more evidence around this. But I know myself from trying to do something on my phone compared to trying to do it on a laptop, I find it challenging. And I can imagine for many of our young children, that's the case as well. And also this is interesting, that kind of huge pressure to deliver everything live. What they found is actually the live lessons don't always work the best. And it's back to that idea of what works best for your children. Is it some short sessions? Is it conversation-based sessions? And what they've also suggested is perhaps sometimes that kind of mixing a model of giving the children something beforehand to think about, and then having the live lessons. So sometimes that's described as a bit like flipped learning. You give a bit of learning beforehand in a story or a piece of information that goes, or something you've recorded, and then you talk to them later on about it. So they've had time to digest, they've had time to explore, and then you can have perhaps a better conversation afterwards as well. So that brings us to kind of stories, doesn't it, in books? And I'm sure anyone, when thinking about remote learning, one of the things that we miss the most is that opportunity to share stories with children. And we know, don't we, it's so important in early childhood because they offer so much. And I love this idea that it helps them explore about who they are as well. It's that chance to try different things out, but also to hear how other characters have solved challenges and so on. The power of stories is absolutely amazing and a critical tool and a really powerful gateway in terms of interactions. Certainly, I don't know about yourselves, but I often have quite passionate conversations about different books that I've read and my feeling about those books and so on. And we know young children feel the same, don't they? But they have their favourite books and they're very willing to tell you why it's their favourite text. And with remote learning, that's more difficult, isn't it? Because we can't grab that moment when we see that child really engaged with that particular text. And so that's why we need to do as much work with parents, don't we, about stories as possible. So, exploring the familiar, using something familiar, what happened next, all those kind of things we do, but also those new texts, simply presenting a cover to the children as a teaser, as a taster, and saying, what do you think is going to happen in this? We're going to talk about it later on in the week, what your views are, just giving them a little kind of trailer, cinema kind of trailer, and so on, to spark a conversation. And then also, it reminds me of some of the work I've done in the past using a project the National Gallery used to run called Take One Picture, and how paintings can be so powerful. Paintings, photographs, whatever it may be, but that image can be really powerful as a learning tool to explore what children see, what children think, what children understand. And so, again, this might be something you'd want to think about is, sharing an image with the children and saying, right, okay, I'm going to share this with you, and then we're going to talk about it again in a few days' time. Chat to your mum and dad. What do you think is going on in here? What can you see? When do you think it might have been? And then actually with the project Take One Picture, this often led into larger art projects across whole schools. So, early years through to year 6 and so on. And I know I've seen it in some early year settings as well. But that idea that one image can spark lots and lots of learning potential. So Rousseau's Tiger, for example, children just exploring and looking in detail and taking time to explore and to think. And then as practitioners, we think, well, what could they do next linked to this that they'll be able to access remotely as well? One of the other things they discovered in the Ofsted research was that critical to the whole thing was engagement, and both children and parents still feeling part of the school. And I know that many who've been doing remote learning have been finding ways to do wonderful assemblies online and so on, so that people still feel part of the community rather than isolated and drifting away. And finding that way to keep people together seems to be having a really powerful impact. So I think anything that can help keep that sense of togetherness seems to really, really be valuable. And then thinking about that idea back to talk, ultimately what those children want, isn't it, is someone who's really interested in what they have to say. And for some, it's also having that fresh voice, those fresh ears, isn't it, who they haven't seen all day, who suddenly it's like they're bursting to tell you. It's a bit like, the Monday morning syndrome in school when you've got so many children that want to come in and tell you what they did at the weekend. I can imagine there's so many children in a remote learning situation who are just desperate to tell you what they've been doing and to dive in. And this also reminded me of something from the Leuven scales and Ferrell-Lavers, I'm sure many of you are familiar with, that concept of care width. Ferrer has this idea that you can only really hold a certain number of children in your mind at one particular time, that kind of spotlight, and how sometimes some children can end up being a bit in the shadows. One of the activities we'd often do with schools and settings is literally write down everybody that's in your class and see who you've forgotten, and make sure those are the children you go and speak to the next day. I think one of the things perhaps we need to be mindful with remote learning is we know that some children may connect more than others. So it's back to what we talked about at the very beginning, is how do we keep those connections? How do we make sure that nobody is kind of in the shadows? Does everybody know who everybody is? Is everybody getting the support that they can? So you know that nobody's been left behind, I guess, really. So again, you might want to simply just jot down who all your class are and see who's been forgotten, see who needs that attention the next day. I also just wanted to hear quickly just some other source of information that you might find useful. I'm sure you're aware of many of these things, but I just thought I'd flag them up. The Hungry Little Minds scheme that was developed by the BBC. Google it, have a look on the website. There's lots and lots of activities and things on there as well. It's been particularly designed for parents, so well worth having a look if you're not familiar with that. There's also, I'm sure some of you are familiar with the Oak online classroom. There are some early years resources on there. Again, have a look, see if they fit with what you do. They may give you some ideas of what you would like to do yourself. I had a little dive in, there were people telling stories and so on. So there's some quite nice things on there. But I think have a look, see how it fits with your children, what your children really need. And Natural Literacy Trust, again, if you're not familiar, on their website, again, they've got lots of information for parents about supporting that development of early literacy and early language, worth having a little look on as well. Lots of free resources on there for parents. And just to kind of draw things to a conclusion, really, I started off talking about unique child, and I just want to go back to the UIFS really, and those kind of core principles. Um, I think, as I've kind of hinted at all the way through, I think what's going to be key for so many children through a remote learning experience is going to be the maintaining of some form of relationship with school, with setting, and because that's what's really going to help them cope as we move forward. And it's going to help us manage that transition back into whatever the new normal may be. When we think about enabling environments, we need to be thinking about an online enabling environment or a remote enabling environment. We're not really creating our classroom in their homes. We need to think differently, but we still want it to be a place that supports young children in the way that they learn, whether it be the work we offer through technology or whether it be what we offer in terms of suggestions for things for parents to do at home with the children. We also, of course, need to be mindful all the way through that back to that unique child, that children are learning at different rates. And I'm often mindful of that idea that children in early years, their life experience is so different in terms of scale of time, often than their peers, that we need to be mindful that our remote offer still reflects that, still supports the individual needs of those children. And that focusing on the learning, really, that kind of idea of less is more, which we often talk about. What is really going to help them? What is really going to support them? What are they really going to enjoy as well? That time to talk, as I mentioned earlier on. Okay. I just wanted to flag up a couple of other things for you in case you're not aware of them. On our website, we have lots and lots of blogs, and the latest ones that are going up there at the moment have been written by Andy Burt, I'm sure lots of you know, and they're focusing in on homeschool learning, and he's going to be doing a series of them on different aspects, and again, offering some ideas and some suggestions. Well worth having a look, all free, so please do have a look at those. We've also got obviously a couple of events coming up in the near future. So in March is going to be our next national briefing, looking at kind of the ongoing stuff around the revised EYFS. And we know there'll be lots more things probably by then as well. So please do have a look there. We'd love to see you at that session. And of course, if you ever need any particular support from us, please do get in touch. We're still able to offer as much as we can remotely at the moment. And even if you just want to get in touch and just to explore how we might be able to support you, please do drop us a line. We're always really, really glad to hear from you. And as I promised right at the very beginning, there's my email address and my Twitter kind of address. Please do get in touch if there's anything else that you'd like to know, whether it's about today's session or what other things that we're doing as well. Be really, really pleased to hear from you. Okay. I hope it's just gone 7 o'clock, so I hope you found this session useful. As I said, thanks so much for taking the time to spend this hour with us. And we'd love to see the kind of things that you've been doing, so please do copy us into anything you put on social media or just drop us a line. Above all, in these times, look after yourselves. It's so important, isn't it? It's never been more important. Take care, keep safe, keep well, and let's hope we can actually meet face to face again in the not too distant future. Take care. Bye-bye.